Donald Trump today snatching a potentially devastating legal defeat from the jaws of a crushing political defeat and likely hobbling his own case for the national emergency he declared today. That national emergency for border wall funding, breaking norms and potentially laws, and costing the president support among Republicans in Congress and among many high-profile members of his base. But to get to his wall and to deliver on one of his signature campaign promises, he had to declare an emergency, right?
I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster. And I don't have to do it for the election. I've already done a lot of wall for the election, 2020. And the only reason we're up here talking about this is because of the election.
What? Who says that out loud? And if you're looking for a halfway decent analysis of the legal mess Trump made for himself this week by usurping the power of the purse from Congress, Trump gave us that too.
We will have a national emergency, and we will then be sued, and they will sue us in the Ninth Circuit, even though it shouldn't be there, and we will possibly get a bad ruling, and then we'll get another bad ruling, and then we'll end up in the Supreme Court, and hopefully we'll get a fair shake.
And apropos of nothing other than the fact that Donald Trump tweeted this morning about the 25th Amendment, and made these comments as though daring his cabinet to just, toss it around as a possibility. Here are some of the other bizarre moments from today's unhinged performance in the Rose Garden.
I never did politics before. Now I do politics. I use many stats.
Could you share those stats with us?
Let me tell you, you have stats that are far worse than the ones that I use. But I use many stats. I want to wish our new Attorney General great luck and speed and enjoy your life. Rush Limbaugh, I think he's a great guy. He's a guy who can speak for 3 hours without a phone call. Try doing that sometime. And Coulter, I don't know her. I hardly know her. I haven't spoken to her in way over a year. I like her. But she's off the reservation. You're CNN. You're fake news. You have an agenda. This administration does a tremendous job, and we don't get credit for it. He had rocket ships, and he had missiles flying over Japan. And they had alarms going off. You know that. Now all of a sudden they feel good. They feel safe. I did that. My button is bigger than yours and my button works. Remember that? And people said, Trump is crazy.
Wait, because she said it better than I can. Here's Ann Coulter.
More than any other presidential mandate in the history of the nation, Trump's mandate was to build wall up. No one thought, oh, yeah, look, he was governor of the biggest state in the union. He used to run the CIA. He was Reagan's vice president. He was, he was FDR's. No, it was one thing, the promise he made every single day at every single speech.
Yeah.
So forget the fact that he's digging his own grave. This is just, look, the only national emergency is that our president is an idiot.
Peter.
I was in the Rose Garden as this took place, basically in the front rows, and just to watch back those clips over the course of this day is just.
Does it give you PTSD?
We're all dealing with a little something, I think. Here's the bottom line. This was remarkable for a bunch of reasons. Let's start with the ones that may actually matter here as it relates to the national emergency. The president erased in our exchange there. He erased any doubt about his motivation for this national emergency, saying, I didn't need to do this. I just wanted to do it faster. Already Democrats have pounced on this. The ACLU, which is going to be challenging this declaration, is already using that in the first sentence of the release they posted today. The bottom line is, national emergencies are not to be scheduled. You can't talk about national emergencies for a couple years, for a couple months, and then say, we're going to do it next Tuesday in the Rose Garden. It's a national emergency.
And then in the Rose Garden say, but no, it's not an emergency.
That's the very point. I mean, the bottom line is, within seconds of announcing that he was going to do this, he said, I really didn't need to do this. I'm just doing it because I want to move forward.
I just want to push back on something you said. I don't think it doesn't matter that Ann Coulter called him an idiot and that he acted like one. I mean, Donald Trump is aware enough of conversations about whether or not the 25th Amendment gets batted around that he retweeted this morning from his Twitter feed a comment from Alan Dershowitz about the 25th Amendment.
Yeah, well, the reason when we talk about Ann Coulter, though, the bottom line, you saw Laura Ingraham, you saw Sean Hannity, all these comments in recent days. The president addressed all of those relationships here. Ann Coulter is one. The president can say, I don't know Ann Coulter. The president has praised her in the past routinely. I can name 3 past occasions where he said things complimentary about her. But for a lot of those voices, there's not a lot of other places for them to go here, right?
But here's the power of Ann Coulter, and I don't mean to, I never thought I'd find myself in this position. Ann Coulter saying the president is an idiot. He could be naked, and not that I wish this on anybody, but he could be naked, and the 4 of us could say, for 60 straight minutes, the president's naked. 40% of the country would think the 4 of us are liars. He's not naked. He's fully dressed. Ann Coulter comes out and says he's buck bleep naked, and they suddenly see him as naked because Ann Coulter has had a more intimate relationship, agrees with his base on more issues than he does. I think the break with Ann Coulter is a thing because her calling him an idiot has a lot more power than anybody anywhere else calling him an idiot.
Look, I don't know that. I obviously heartening to hear Ann Coulter say that in a way. It cheers the spirit in some ways, the soul, to hear someone like that speaking the plain truth so clearly. But, I don't know that Ann Coulter has any actual political followers or following. It overstates her power. She's a mirror.
Books she sells.
I know, I understand that. But I'm not sure there's a lot of people out there in Trump Nation who, like, if Ann Coulter decides to defect and become a Trump hater, they're not going to suddenly be like, oh, Ann Coulter's leaving the president, I'm going with Ann Coulter. Where I think it's important is that in December, Ann Coulter single-handedly, almost with the help of Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity, threw the entire country into disarray. The president was ready to sign a deal. He was ready to make the deal, keep the government funded, et cetera, do all this stuff. And then Ann Coulter made a stink. And it mattered so much to Donald Trump that he derailed everything and threw us into the longest government shutdown in history. Now, is 2 months later, he suffered all that damage, and at the end of all of it, he's not made her happy. She's calling him an idiot. And I think the biggest thing it says is, what a loser. I mean, she was like the only person he wanted to make happy. He threw the country into disarray to basically make her and Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity happy. And at the end of all of this, they're not happy either. I mean, Nancy Pelosi kicked his ass in the shutdown, and now he's out there like begging for crumbs, and she's calling him an idiot on national television. I mean, how much worse could it get for him on this issue, in this particular fight that he's fought? He's lost on every front.
Joyce, I follow Neil Katyal and George Conway, and it always gets my attention when they agree aggressively and with vigor on something, and within moments of one another, they both tweeted that the first lines in the lawsuits against this emergency declaration will be the president's own comments today in the Rose Garden. Is that the legal case against an emergency, that the person who declared the emergency said there was no emergency?
I think Peter became a hero for plaintiffs' lawyers across the country today when he asked the president that question. I literally could not believe the answer, because what lawyers have been bandying about, constitutional lawyers, the smart people that I don't include myself among, but they've been having a conversation about the extent of the executive power being the focus of this, with courts giving great deference to the president over his determination that something is a national emergency. And of course they would have argued that, but not expected necessarily to win. Now the president, I think, has put that into question. The data has always suggested that there's no national emergency here. Crime is down, immigration is down, drugs don't come in through the border like the president seems to think that they do. And now here we've got the president himself essentially saying, it's not a national emergency. And every lawyer will pick up on that. And Trump may think that they're going to go to the Ninth Circuit, the most liberal circuit in the country. There will undoubtedly be cases there. But there's at least one case in progress on the Texas border. That's in the Fifth Circuit, one of the very conservative circuits that exists in the Deep South. I expect that they will succeed there as well, and the president will have only himself to thank for their victory.
So they'll lose, likely, legally. The Republican Party also died another death today. I texted Joe Scarborough, and I said, I know we say it a million times, but is this the death knell, that there's anything conservative? He said, I've completely given up predicting how low Republicans will go for this guy. I mean, this is a Republican Party that screamed from the rooftops when President Barack Obama Obama issued an executive order that happened to also be about immigration. This is a vice president in Mike Pence who was among the loudest screamers. This was a party that made this such a political issue. This is a party that laid down today and begged Donald Trump to drive his choo-choo train over their dead bodies.
And this is a party who sued Barack Obama when he took executive action for Obamacare subsidies and won on the issue that it was executive overreach and that the power of the purse rests with the Congress, not with the White House. There are a few Republicans who are very uncomfortable about this and who came out and said that they wish that the president would not do that. So it is not completely
I kind of want John Cornyn
yesterday.
Well, right. Now Mitch McConnell.
Right beforehand, Mitch McConnell was among those people saying, no, you shouldn't do this. This is a bad idea. It's a bad idea. I will support the president declaring a national emergency.
So the ones that didn't flip,
yes.
I counted one. Were there more than John Cornyn today?
There was Senator Collins.
How many?
Rubio, Collins, I think Murkowski said something.
Who criticized him today? Anybody?
Well,
I saw one.
Well, Congress is
half
out
the country.
Today.
One.
Recess. But the point is, this is a big problem for them. This idea of the separation of powers, this idea of the rule of law, the overreach of the executive branch has been a Republican call over and over again throughout every Democratic administration, and President Trump is throwing that out of the window. And I think he knows that this is a loser for him legally. He's just using this as a political fight. That whole spiel about how he's going to lose and it's because it's political and this, that, and I'm sure he's been informed. This is a terrible thing to do. It's going to be challenged and you will likely lose, but he doesn't care. He's boxed in. He lost in the fight with Nancy Pelosi. He's boxed in, and this is the only place that he can go politically.
What, if you're a Republican and you want to be the president, you're not 70 like most of them in the Senate, you today read a book about what Republicans used to sound like and talk like and act like, and you come out aggressively against this. You join Neil Katyal and George Conway's legal argument against it.
I think I would, if I were a Republican, an ambitious Republican looking for the future, I'm not talking about the short-term future. I'm talking about Republicans who might, in some theoretical universe, decide to challenge Trump in 2020. But if you're looking down the road for life after Trump, something that it seems none of them have had any ability to even fathom that there would be such a thing for the last 2 years. One of the most incomprehensible things in the world is the notion that, people, as an example, people who have lied to the House Intel Committee, not seeming to understand that in 2 years Democrats could control that committee and that they would be in trouble for perjuring themselves. All of these elected Republicans still seem to dwell in this world where they find it impossible to project their minds 24 months or, heaven forbid, 6 years forward, that there's going to be a world after Donald Trump. And in that world, standing up to Donald Trump on this issue, exhibiting some kind of spine, some kind of principle, and enunciating some of the old Republican verities would do them great good in their long-term political futures. But they have behaved in totally irrational ways, as far as I'm concerned, for the last 2 years, just in terms of their self-interest, and they seem to be continuing down that path.
I want to give you the last word. Every week is like 11 weeks long. This has been like the longest January, February of my life. But
you're welcome to come to the White House and join us.
I ask you what might know, but we live and die by all your great reporting from there. What happens next?
Well, there are different ways to view what happens next, right? You can view it in the short term and in the long term. In the short term, this guy is a day trader, right? So he's going to be fighting the next fight in the moment that it occurs. When you're challenging him with a question, as we witnessed in the Rose Garden today, he's quickly just trying to come up with some facts, some information, something he heard from a friend on the phone call late last night, and just spews it, right? One about the legal ports of entry. The president today said it was a lie to say, why are you declaring a national emergency now? You guys controlled Congress for 2 years. He says, well, you blame Paul Ryan. It was his fault then, right? So in terms of what comes next, frankly, who knows what comes next? I think we just saw the beginning of 2020. Obviously, the president's just like, he's all in. This is the way we're going to go. We're going to hang this one up in the courts. But the bottom line is he pushed aside the fight with Congress to introduce a battle in the courts, and he frankly thinks that that's one, at least rhetorically, that's a little bit easier to fight with. The courts can't fight back, at least the way that some of these lawmakers conceivably could.
Joyce Vance, what happens next legally? I mean, does this declaration go through and money, do construction workers head to the border and start hammering with hammers and nails? Or does this all get stopped? Because I know Jared and the president, they looked at pictures and paint colors and swatches, but does this get stopped before anybody rolls up in the pickup?
So there's a little grace period here. The president can actually spend some money under legislation that was passed in the waning days of the Obama administration for fencing. But I think what really happens here is based on the statute that's involved in calling for a national emergency situation. And that permits Congress to override the president's determination. I think we'll likely see that begin in the House. The Senate will have to take a vote on it, as the way that this law is written. And so we will actually have an on-the-record accounting for all of our elected officials. Do they believe in the rule of law? Do they support the rule of law? Or are they willing to throw the rule of law into the trash can and support this president? And that may be the compelling development as a result of what has happened this morning.
You agree with that?
No, I think she's exactly right? The whole point was to avoid this moment, and all of a sudden this is the moment that's going to show up in their laps right now. Gerald Nadler has already said it. The Democrat has already said, hey, this is going to happen, the joint resolution of termination. Republicans in the Senate are going to have to vote on this thing. The president vetoes. But they're all on the record.
All right, you're going to be watching it first. We're so lucky to have you here today. Thank you.
Quick hustle. Thanks for having me.
We're going to sneak in a break. We'll be right back. Dr. James.
See ya.
Summertime's getting hotter, your winter's getting milder. It is the effects that it has on everything across the world. The ocean levels rising and encroaching on cities, the wildlife in that area. I mean, there's cascading
effects. A lot of issues, coastal communities, flooding. There's a lot going on. So thank you for giving me a little.
Wildfires getting more intense, hurricanes getting more intense. We could go on and on. Ali Velshi, let's do climate change
more often, and I'll see you in an hour.
You will. It's 11 a.m. at West and 2 p.m. at the White House, where today the president declared a national emergency to get his wall, and then he admitted he didn't need to.
I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster.
Which raises the question, is there an actual emergency to declare, or is this just a political emergency for a president who just suffered a big legislative loss? When the president was asked about the statistics, the facts, in other words, that dispute every claim he makes in support of his wall, he said he has his own, let's call them alternative facts.
That shows undocumented immigrants committing crime at lower levels. That shows undocumented criminals or undocumented immigrants committing crime at lower levels than native-born Americans. What do you say to
you don't really believe that stat? Do you really believe that?
What do you? Well, let me ask
you
this.
Our federal
I believe in facts and statistics.
Okay, any more quick? Let's go.
So your own government stats are wrong? Are you saying?
No, I use many stats.
Could you share those stats with us?
Let me tell you, you have stats that are far worse than the ones that I use. But I use many stats, but I also use Homeland Security.
Here are the facts. According to government data from Customs and Border Protection, illegal border crossings are at the lowest level since 1971 and have been on the decline for almost 20 years after peaking in 2000. And only 3% of immigrants stopped at the border crossing at legal ports of entry or illegally have a criminal history. And the drugs that President Trump says are pouring across the southern border, they mostly come in through the legal ports of entry. So if all the facts are against you and you admit you don't need to do what you're doing, why are you doing it?
And I don't have to do it for the election. I've already done a lot of wall for the election, 2020. And the only reason we're up here talking about this is because of the election. Because they want to try and win an election, which it looks like they're not going to be able to do.
So it's about the election, but it's not about the election, but it is about the election. Besides, what in the world is he talking about? Our big question today is, if he didn't need to do it, why did he do it? Joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Jeff Bennett, MSNBC Capitol Hill correspondent Garrett Haake, and the anchor and executive producer of NPR's Latino USA, Maria Hinojosa. Everybody welcome. Jeff, what's going on behind the scenes? Because on the one hand, the Washington Post is reporting that there was a lot of drama yesterday, that he had to be pulled back from the brink and convinced to sign this bill. And then the New York Times and Maggie Haberman are saying he was always going to sign it. He just wanted to create some drama.
Yeah, and here's the thing, Katie, and I know you know this from having covered Donald Trump on the campaign trail for 2 years. Donald Trump so often says and does things to just push through to the next news cycle. And so in this instance, you have the White House and the president trying to manage the political fallout of the president being on the losing side of this negotiation with Congress. The fact that he declared a national emergency, I think, is a tacit admission that he was unable to persuade lawmakers and the American public of his political imperative about this border wall. So even as this declaration might, quiet the criticism from conservative commentators in the short term, in the long term, this presents some problems for the president. First thing is that this declaration is unpopular. Even more unpopular than the actual border wall, the notion of the border wall is with the American public. Two, he risks splitting his party, particularly in the Senate, over the question of whether or not his declaration is a matter of presidential overreach. And then thirdly, the president is relitigating a losing issue. We know from the last election that his demagogic rhetoric about immigrants is what, in part, that's one of the reasons why the GOP lost 40 House seats in districts they should probably have won, in suburban districts and in some Republican strongholds. So we'll have to see how the White House cleans up the president's comment to Peter Alexander where he says, I didn't have to do this. But this is fraught for the president politically, Kate.
We're going to have Lawrence Tribe on in a second, and I imagine that as a constitutional scholar, that he would argue that that sort of comment is something that attorneys for the president will hate, and attorneys who want to sue the president for this, or anyone who wants to sue the president for this, will love that sort of comment, him actually admitting that he doesn't need to declare a national emergency. Garrett, Jeff asked this question, what are Republicans going to do? There have been a number of Republicans who have said that they did not think this was a good idea. Let's play some of them and let's ask on the back end whether or not they're going to vote to try and overturn this.
I don't think it's a good idea. I think it'll be a terrible idea. I hope he doesn't do it. I don't
would
think
you
it's
fight him on it?
Either. Sure, because I think that it's important.
I would hate to see it. Using that act, it would be, in this instance, would be a far larger act than has ever occurred in the past. So I'd prefer not.
I hate the idea of an emergency because I always worry about that abuse with future presidents.
I think it would be a mistake for the president to invoke his national emergency powers for this purpose, and that it would be of dubious constitutionality.
So, Garrett, it's a terrible idea. They would hate to see it. They hate the idea again. I think it would be a mistake. If that is the consensus, are these very same Republicans going to sit back and let the president do it?
We're going to find out, Katie. Credit where it's due of those folks you just played. I have in my inbox a statement from Tom Tillis, Republican senator from North Carolina, just sent it out saying he doesn't believe in situational constitutional principles, and he was against this kind of overreach when it happened under President Obama, and he says he remains against it now under President Donald Trump. Now, you can ask what they're going to do about this. Some of this will depend on what the House does, because the way we see the congressional response happening here is it's likely that the House will pass a privileged resolution. They can respond to this in such a way that if it passes the House condemning this, and I think we can all assume that that will be the case, the Senate will then have to take it up. It's a simple majority move. That means to pass in the Senate, they just need to pick up a handful of Republicans who are willing to go on the record with their votes saying they condemn this action by Donald Trump. Now, can they get a veto-proof majority? Probably not, but they could still force the president to use his first ever actual veto on this measure, which would be a pretty strong symbolic defeat. So we've got Tom Tillis out here with this statement, but I suspect Congress is out next week, so this will be challenging. But over the next few weeks, I'll be spending a large amount of my time and energy chasing down these Republican senators to get them on that specific question. Okay, you think this is a bad idea and you're against it, but are you willing to back that up with a vote? And I think that'll play out over time when we see what the House does first.
What about Mitch McConnell? Why is Mitch McConnell suddenly backing this?
Mitch McConnell has been interesting on this. He's been one of those people who was warning the president publicly, and it's been reported privately not to take this route. Then yesterday, he came to the floor and said the president's going to sign this bill, sign the spending bill. Also, he's going to declare a national emergency, and I support that. Let's vote in 30 minutes. It was a very quick move from McConnell. Afterwards, I was part of a group of reporters who tried to talk to McConnell when he left the floor, and one reporter asked, are you really going to support this? And McConnell said, well, what I'm really going to do is get the president to sign a piece of legislation legislation. Then his statement today went around the idea of saying he supports it. It's fascinating because what it looks like to me, my inference here, is that Mitch McConnell very much wanted to see the president put his signature on this spending bill, and I think you will see McConnell largely leaving the president to defend himself on the national emergency part of this. He has said he would support him, but he didn't come out and robustly do that in his statement, his first opportunity to do so today.
Maria, none of the facts, the statistics, the numbers, the government information is on the president's side for this. None of it. And it hasn't been on his side for this since day one of his campaign, and he has been told this over and over and over again. What do you do when you're dealing with somebody who refuses to see the truth?
You know, Katie, this is a really difficult time. For example, I'm a professor. Part of one of the things that I'm doing, I'm a professor. So in my class yesterday at DePaul University in Chicago, mostly Latinas and Latinas, this is not kind of like, oh, budget talks, oh, you know, mortgage rates, oh, you know, school clothes. Like, this is actually very deep and emotional for them. So this is a very, very tough time because we know that these are basically untruths, you know, lies. But just to give context, like when this president says there is an invasion, so basically what we're talking about, family groups accounted for 59% of all border apprehensions. Family groups, do you understand? So that means that these are people who are coming in looking for support as a family, not as, you know, these murderers, killers, rapists. The number of family unit members taken into custody is up 290% during the first 4 months of the fiscal year. So this is not an invasion of some kind. I mean, it's all false, and frankly, it's so hard because we're having to talk about something that is completely based on falsehoods. And you know what I'm concerned about tomorrow, Katie? What would the headlines of our newspapers say? Will they be double? You know, will they be bolded? Across the board, president declares national emergency? Because then we're playing into this.
Here's the thing about this. The president, it's not as if Democrats were not for a border wall or border fencing or a border barrier or stronger borders. They have been. They voted on it in the past. It wasn't a extremely divisive issue. The president has made it an extremely divisive issue with the way he talks about the border, the way he describes the border, the facts that don't line up with his descriptions of the border, this idea that all people that want to come into this country are criminals who want to hurt you. I mean, he's made it a moral argument as opposed to an argument just for, hey, listen, we need a strong border, it's our country. He's taken it a step further. And I think that's part of the reason why so many people in this country who were otherwise for it are not for it today. And Coulter, always for the wall, really liked the president, wanted the wall. For it for all the reasons the president was trying to sell it, and this idea that immigrants were criminals. Well, she's not happy. She spoke to KABC Radio. Listen to what she said.
More than any other presidential mandate in the history of the nation, Trump's mandate was to build walls. No one thought, oh, yeah, look, he was governor of the biggest state in the union. He used to run the CIA. He was Reagan's vice president. He was, he was FDR's. No, it was one thing, the promise he made every single day at every single speech. So forget the fact that he's digging his own grave. This is just, look, the only national emergency is that our president is an idiot.
Maria?
You know, if only we could just kind of be like, oh, he's an idiot. I mean, it's a very big problem, but here, what happened today, by the way, I think it's fascinating that there was a declaration of the national emergency. It took him basically 5 minutes to get to the part of declaring a national emergency.
Spent half the time talking about China.
Exactly. So let's not be taken, all of us journalists. It was, for me, something that stood out was the kind of the move in the language that not only criticizes and says there's an invasion, but warlike language. So now he's saying we're breaking up these caravans. These are caravans of families that are actually seeking refuge. They're refugees, like the Jewish who came here seeking refuge, like the Vietnamese. We have a history of this. And we have this president saying we're breaking up the caravans. It's a very scary turn where now we're talking with warlike languages, warlike words. in terms of people that really pose no threat. We already see it all over. It's only
you can think you want stronger borders. You can say you want stronger borders. You can think, hey, listen, people should be allowed to claim asylum, and if those claims are found to be true, then yes, we'll deal with you here. And then you can also think that everybody else who's not making a valid claim for assignment should be sent home to deal with the problems in their own country and face them themselves. You can think that, but he is not making those distinctions. What he's doing is he's saying everybody that's coming in is a threat to Americans. Maria Hinojosa, thank you so much for joining us. We always like to have you. Garrett Hake, thank you. And Jeff Bennett, there you are. Thank you as well. Joining me now, Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Tribe. He's also the co-author of To End a Presidency, The Power of Impeachment. All right, Lawrence, this is going into the courts. The president today said that he didn't need to do this. Is that a good idea for him to declare?
Well, he certainly made it easier to challenge what he's doing. You can be sure that that's going to be in every one of the challenges that is brought. He didn't need to do this. He says he's doing it just in order to speed things up, but then he admits that he's going to get stalled in the courts. So he's really doing it just to please part of his base. Courts, however, are not always realistic. They often defer to the president. So what exactly is going to happen in the courts is quite a different question.
So the legality of this is a big question. The president even admits that this is probably going to go to the Supreme Court. He believes he's going to lose in the Ninth Circuit because he thinks, in his mind, the Ninth Circuit isn't fair, it's too liberal, and that hasn't ruled in his favor in the past. But then he thinks, in his words, he's going to get a fair shake in the Supreme Court. Why would he think that?
Well, I suppose it has something to do with Justice Kavanaugh. I do think the court is likely to be divided 5-4, but it's going to deal with a unique situation. There have been emergencies in the past, real ones, like the threatened strikes that were going to prevent military equipment from getting to our troops in Korea. And then when Truman tried to deal with that, by seizing the steel mills, the Supreme Court told him no, that he needs congressional authorization. This time, not only does he not have direct congressional authorization, but Congress rebuffed his request. And under the National Emergencies Act of 1976, no emergency has ever been used to spend money that Congress was asked to allow the president to spend and refused to allow him to spend. The power of the purse belongs to Congress. That's not just a phrase. The Constitution is very explicit about no money being spent without congressional appropriation.
What if he goes to the Pentagon? What if he goes, though, to the Pentagon and he says, I'm going to take the money from the Pentagon used to stop illegal drugs from being smuggled over the border, and I'm going to say that in order to do that, I want to build my wall. Is that an easier argument for him?
Well, it's not the Pentagon that he has to persuade. Under the statute that Congress enacted, the National Emergencies Act, one of the laws that is triggered specifically deals with reappropriating and reprogramming military funds. But it says they can be reprogrammed only when essential to the national defense. So courts are going to have to look at whether this is essential to the national defense. There's no evidence that it is. It's not at all like the emergencies that were declared by Bush 41 in order to repel Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. It's not like the national emergency declared by Bush 43 right after 9/11. Those were unexpected events in which it was essential to the national defense to expend resources. Here we have the conservative courts, which might be inclined to defer to the president, also committed to a principle that goes back not only to the original Constitution, but to 17th century England, where the crown was not allowed to spend money when Parliament didn't authorize it. And here we have the unique situation, not only of Congress not authorizing it, but of Congress telling the president no. So the only emergency is that he was basically a bad negotiator.
Well, let me ask you
the
this.
The only emergency is that Sean Hannity doesn't like it.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
I was a philosophy major, and the first thing you do when you're making an argument or making a thesis in philosophy is define your terms. Is there a hard and fast definition for national emergency? And if there's not, I suspect there's not, how much room is there for interpretation?
Well, you suspect correctly. There's some room for interpretation. If courts were not to abjectly defer to the president, they would say that whatever else it means, an emergency has to be something sudden, something that comes upon you like a hurricane or a flood or an invasion, a real invasion. But courts are not always realistic. They're likely to say that an emergency is pretty much up to the president to declare. But by declaring an emergency, he doesn't get any automatic power. He has to point out which statutes are triggered by a national emergency. There are over 120 of them. The only one that he could point to that gives him the $3.6 billion, the bulk of the added money that he wants, is one that is quite narrow in scope. It's part of a section of the U.S. Code dealing with navigation and military installations. And it's an incredible stretch to treat that language as applicable here. And I bet that despite the enormous constitutional stakes and the precedent that's established, a lot of this will come down to whether a fifth justice, probably the Chief Justice, interprets Section 2293 of 33 U.S. Code, a technical section, as covering this case. It's odd that something this huge might turn on something that small, but that's the way life often goes. This is going to be a protracted litigation.
Yeah. I love that you can recite the U.S. Code off the top of your head, Larry. Thank you so much.
I haven't memorized it all, Katie, but I do some homework.
You certainly do. Lawrence Tribe. Thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it. And still to come, a judge ruled Paul Manafort lied. Now the special counsel wants to move his sentencing up. Why? But right after this break, the emergency is declared. Speaker Pelosi is weighing her options to fight it. What exactly is on the table right now? California Democratic Congressman John Garamendi joins me in a moment.
Morning Joe speaks truth to power. They're undermining this constitutional republic with access to the people.
Since 1985, SelectQuote has saved over 1 million families millions of dollars on life insurance. Call now. 800-711-7857 or visit SelectQuote.com. Discover what over 1 million families know now. We shop, you save.
Congressional Democrats are already plotting a response to President Trump's national emergency. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi called the plan, quote, lawless and a gross abuse of power. And she vowed to take action, tweeting the Congress will defend our constitutional authorities. But what can congressional Democrats actually do to stop the president? Joining me now is Democratic Congressman John Garamendi of California. He's a member of the Armed Services Committee. Congressman, thank you very much for being here. I know this is an issue that cuts close for you because of the committee that you sit on and where the president potentially wants to get this money. What can congressional Democrats do to try and stop this if they want to?
Well, let's take that one up first. I am the chairman in the House of the Readiness Committee. The Readiness Committee oversees all military bases, all training, all equipment for all of the military, wherever they may be, and all military construction. We review the military construction every year. We set aside specific projects that are highest priority, like adding a new battery of missiles to the anti-missile defense system in Alaska, Greeley, Alaska, like repairing the damage at Kendall Air Force Base, a multi-billion-dollar problem because of the hurricane, and Camp Lejeune, again, flooding because of hurricanes. Billions of dollars all around the world, considered to be extraordinarily important. If the president thinks he's going to get his hands on that money without a major fight, he simply is putting his hands on a very hot stove, and we're going to force him every way we can to retreat from that. Secondly, Mr. Tribe very, very carefully and very articulately laid out the constitutional issue. This Congress is not going to be responsible for the abdication any further of its power. We're not about to allow the president to usurp usurp the power of the purse. It is our power. We must and we will defend it. And finally, those lawsuits are going to be out there. I would expect that we will, Ms. Pelosi will take all of these things under consideration, including the resolution, which I'm sure will pass the House if it were to be taken up. And then on the Senate floor, there are 51 senators who care about the Constitution. And finally, a point with regard to the conservatives on the Supreme Court. They like to fancy themselves as being constitutionalist. Well, we may very well find out exactly what that means.
California is going to sue. AG Becerra has already indicated that, and we just got word from Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, saying that that is what they plan to do at this news conference that they held right after the president did declare a national emergency. Is it the place of individual states to sue, or should this be? Is it better for Congress to do it, because after all, this is money that's being taken out of the hands of Congress, and you guys do have, according to our Constitution, the power of the purse?
Well, there may be an opportunity for Congress to sue. That's possible. But also, any state, any entity that is harmed, for example, not yet discussed in this conversation is the fact that some of those emergency declarations allow the president to go after the Army Corps of Engineers civil works projects. Those civil works projects often are flood projects, dealing with levees, improving them, dam reconstruction, and the like. If any agency across the nation loses the money that has been set aside for them, they are harmed. I believe they would then have standing. I talked to Attorney General Becerra about this a couple of days, 2 days back. We talked about some of the issues and how we might be able to work together to frame a lawsuit at the state. I am delighted that he and the governor have taken the initiative in going at this. This is a fundamental issue. This is not just about a wall. This is about our very democracy, about the three equal branches of government, and about a president suiting himself in imperial robes as though he were some kind of emperor. This is an emperor that will, at the end of this process, find out that those robes do not include the power of the purse.
Sounds like he was being serious when he said, "I alone can do it." California Congressman John Garamendi. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Katie.
And the special counsel has asked for Paul Manafort's sentencing date to be moved up after a judge ruled this week that Manafort intentionally lied about his interactions and communications with a Russian operative. Those interactions include a summer 2016 meeting during which Manafort could have handed off internal polling data from Donald Trump's presidential campaign. According to one New York Magazine writer, that meeting alone could provide, quote, every single element one would need to establish collusion. Joining me now, NBC News investigations reporter Tom Winter, New York Times political reporter Ken Vogel, and Elliot Williams, who lobbies for LawWorks, two different men, an organization advocating the importance of the special counsel. He's also a former deputy assistant attorney general at the DOJ and a former assistant director of ICE. Tom, this Manafort news came out late the other night, and then it got buried by the McCabe news that came out yesterday. Bring us up to speed. The federal courts have decided that Manafort did lie. What does that mean?
So, Katie, what it means is that first off, they're going to try to move forward with sentencing. So Manafort had a trial this summer that we know about, and we covered. In that trial, jury found him guilty of 8 counts. Paul Manafort has subsequently admitted his guilt in the other counts. So right now, the special counsel's office says, hey, this is